The snow had been falling since noon, the kind of heavy, silent snow that makes a city feel like it is holding its breath, and Marcus Wren was standing in the marble lobby of Wren Holdings checking his watch for the fourth time in 6 minutes, because the car was late, and Marcus Wren did not tolerate late. He was 51 years old and had built a private equity empire out of a single failed restaurant and a refusal to ever again be the man who apologized for other people's mistakes. He had a daughter he saw twice a year and a son he had not spoken to in 11 years and a Christmas Eve dinner in 40 minutes with investors who did not care about Christmas either. And when the black Escalade finally pulled up 9 minutes late, Marcus was already composing the sentence he was going to say. The driver stepped out into the snow, young, maybe late 20s, dressed in the company uniform with his collar slightly crooked, and opened the rear door with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned that efficiency was the only thing that kept him employed. Marcus got in without looking at his face. He said, "You're 9 minutes late." "I don't pay for 9 minutes late." The young man said, "Sir, there was an accident on 5th. I had to reroute." Marcus said, "I don't need the explanation. I need the car on time." The young man said nothing else. He pulled back into traffic, and Marcus opened his laptop and did not look up again. And somewhere underneath the irritation, if he had been paying attention, he might have noticed that something about the back of that young man's head, the particular angle of his jaw in the rearview mirror, had made something in his chest tighten for reasons he could not have named. He did not notice. He was too busy being angry about 9 minutes. When they arrived at the restaurant, Marcus got out and said, "Without turning around, don't bother waiting. I'll call a car for the ride home. You're done." The young man said, "Sir?" Marcus said, "I said you're done. Consider tonight your last shift." He walked into the restaurant and did not look back, and the young man stood in the snow next to the Escalade for a long moment before he got back in and drove away, and if Marcus Wren had turned around, just once, he would have seen the young man's hands shaking on the wheel. Not from anger, but from something closer to grief, because he had needed this job more than Marcus could have imagined. And because being fired was not even the worst thing that had happened to him that day. His name was Eli Turner. He was 28 years old. And 40 minutes before Marcus Wren fired him in the snow, he had been standing in a hospital corridor being told that his adoptive mother, the only parent he had ever known, had 11 days left, and that hospice care cost $8,000 a month, and that the job he had held for 6 weeks, the one that finally paid enough to cover it, was the only thing standing between her dying in a hospital bed surrounded by monitors or dying at home surrounded by the quilts she had made him as a child. He had driven Marcus Wren to dinner with that information sitting in his chest like a stone, and he had said nothing about it. Because Eli Turner had learned a long time ago that rich men do not want to hear about your mother. Inside the restaurant, Marcus sat down across from his investors and ordered a bottle of wine he would not remember tasting, and somewhere in the second course, his assistant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya, who had worked for him for 9 years and had never once seen him show real remorse, leaned over and said, "You fired the new driver." Marcus said, "He was late." Priya said, "He's been driving for you 6 weeks. He's never been late before tonight." Marcus said, "Nothing." Priya said, "Do you even know his name?" Marcus realized, with the particular cold discomfort of a man confronted with his own carelessness, that he did not. He said Turner, Eli Turner. Priya said, "Do you know why he applied for this job?" Marcus said no. Priya said, "Because I do the hiring. And I read every application, and his said his mother is in hospice and he needed benefits that started immediately, which we don't usually offer. But I approved it because his file said something else that I thought you should probably know before you fired him in the snow." She slid a folder across the table. Marcus opened it without understanding why his hands had gone cold before he had read a single word. It was Eli Turner's original adoption paperwork, submitted voluntarily as part of a benefits request for a rare genetic screening his mother's oncologist had recommended. The kind of paperwork that lists a birth mother's name if she chose, at the time, to leave one. The name on the page was Callie Turner. Marcus had known a Callie Turner 29 years ago when he was 22 years old and broke and unfinished, before Wren Holdings existed, before the Marble Lobby, before he became a man who fired people in the snow. Callie Turner had been the only person who ever made him believe he could be someone worth loving. And she had disappeared from his life the year she turned up pregnant, and he was too afraid and too poor and too young to know what to do about it, and he had told himself for 29 years that she had simply moved on, found someone else, built a different life. Because that was easier to believe than the alternative, which was that she had carried his child alone and given him up so the boy could have a father who wasn't a scared 22-year-old with nothing to offer. Marcus sat very still. Priya said, "There's a birth date on that page. Do the math." He did the math. It matched. He stood up from the table so fast his chair fell backward. And he did not apologize to the investors, and he did not explain. And he walked out into the snow with his coat still on the back of the chair, and he called the number Priya had already pulled from the employee file with the kind of foresight that comes from 9 years of cleaning up after a man who moves faster than his own conscience. Eli did not answer the first 2 calls. He was sitting in his car outside the hospice facility, engine off, trying to work out how he was going to tell his mother he had lost the job that was paying for her care, trying to find a version of the truth that would not break her heart on what might be one of her last nights of clarity. When his phone rang a 3rd time from an unknown number, he almost didn't answer that one either. But something made him pick up. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the simple human inability to let a phone ring a 3rd time. Marcus said his name. Eli said, "I don't have anything else to say to you, sir. You made yourself clear." Marcus said, "Your mother's name was Callie." The line went silent in a way that felt, even through the phone, like the entire world holding still. Eli said, "How do you know my birth mother's name?" Marcus said, "Because 29 years ago I loved a woman named Callie Turner more than I have loved anything before or since, and I was too much of a coward to go looking for her when she disappeared. And I have spent 29 years telling myself a story about why that was okay, and I think, Eli, I need you to tell me where you're sitting right now. Because I believe I am your father, and I believe I just fired my own son in the snow on Christmas Eve without knowing his name." Eli did not speak for a long time. Outside his window, the snow was still falling, and inside the hospice building 50 feet away, his mother, his real mother, the one who had raised him, who had sung to him, who had 11 days left, was waiting for him to come inside and tell her about his evening, and he had absolutely no idea what he was going to say to her now. He said, "I'm at Riverside Hospice. My mom, my adoptive mom, she doesn't have much time." Marcus said, "I'm coming." Eli said, "You don't have to." Marcus said, "I've had 29 years of not having to." "I'm coming." He arrived 40 minutes later, snow in his hair, no coat, having left it on the back of a chair in a restaurant full of investors he would never call back that night, and he found Eli sitting in the hospice family lounge with his head in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because there is no correct sentence for the moment a father meets the son he fired 6 hours earlier without knowing who he was. Marcus sat down across from him. He said, "I'm not going to pretend the last 29 years didn't happen. I'm not going to pretend I didn't fire you tonight for being 9 minutes late while you were sitting on this kind of news. I just want to know you. However you'll let me." Eli looked at him for a long time. This stranger with his jaw, his eyes, the same slight furrow between the brows that Eli saw in his own reflection every morning and had never understood the source of. He said, "My mom in there, she's the one who raised me. She's the one who's my mother. That doesn't change." Marcus said, "It shouldn't change. I'm not asking it to." Eli said, Then what are you asking? Marcus said, I'm asking if I can sit with you tonight. That's all. I'm asking for tonight. They went in together to see her. Her name was Margaret, and she was 81 years old, and she had adopted Eli when he was 3 days old from a young birth mother who had wanted more than anything for her son to have a stable home, and Margaret had spent 28 years making sure that was true. When Eli introduced Marcus as someone he had just found out was his biological father, Margaret looked at Marcus for a long, searching moment. The look of a woman assessing whether this stranger was a threat to the boy she had raised or something else entirely. And then she said, in a voice made thin by illness but not by weakness, "Well, he has your eyes, doesn't he?" Marcus said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For not looking for Callie. For not looking for him. For being the kind of man who fires people in the snow on Christmas Eve without asking their name." Margaret said, "You found him now." Marcus said, "I fired him first." Margaret laughed. A real laugh. The kind that costs something when you don't have much energy left to spend. And she said, "Then I suppose your first job as his father is to hire him back." Marcus stayed until midnight. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and on the 9th day, when Margaret's breathing had grown shallow and the nurses said it would likely be soon, Marcus sat on one side of her bed and Eli sat on the other, and Margaret took both of their hands, one in each of hers, and said she was glad, at the end, to see her son was not going to be alone. She died on the 11th day, exactly as the doctors had said, at home in the hospice suite Marcus had upgraded without telling anyone. Surrounded by the quilts she had made him as a child, with Eli holding one hand and, for reasons neither of them fully examined out loud, Marcus holding the other. Eli did not go back to driving. Marcus made sure of that. Not with money thrown carelessly at guilt, but with time, actual time. The kind he had never given anyone in 29 years of building an empire designed to insulate him from needing anyone at all. They started having dinner on Sundays. Marcus learned that Eli had studied structural engineering before the bills got too heavy to keep affording school, and 6 months later Eli was enrolled again, tuition paid. Not as a handout, but as what Marcus called, quietly, the interest owed on 29 years of absence. It did not undo the years. Neither of them pretended it did. But the following Christmas Eve, Marcus Wren stood in the same marble lobby. And when the car pulled up 9 minutes early this time, driven by someone else, he did not get in alone. Eli was already in the back seat, having asked to come with him, and as they pulled into the snow together, Marcus finally understood the thing that had tightened in his chest that first night in the rearview mirror. The thing he had been too angry and too blind to name. It had been recognition. It had simply arrived 9 minutes too early for a man who was not yet ready to see it.